So the question that teachers sometimes get, either from a student or from a parent, is why should a student continue to study science if there is no intention of pursuing a career in science? And I believe the answer is really simple. It's one word. It's appreciation. Appreciation of the world and how interconnected all aspects of the world are. Life involves interrelated concepts for all decisions we make, whether they're related to our jobs, our politics, our business investments, our health and well-being, not to mention just living itself. The hope is that through studying science, the students will gain the assets to improve not only the world we live in, but to enjoy the experience to their maximum potential. My goal today is to hopefully show you how you can develop this appreciation in the classroom and how to help the students understand how to use this appreciation in their lives. Shawn Otto's book, The War on Science, begins with a quote from Thomas Jefferson that gets right to the importance of having an educated public to the function of the United States democracy. In 1789, Thomas Jefferson said that whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government, that whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they may be relied on to set them right. This quote will serve as the basis of a correlation between science, business, and government. The world we live in is changing at a rate that is much faster than many people can keep up with. The advances in scientific knowledge due to changes in technology have led us to a point where we are being overwhelmed by new scientific and technological developments. We are also facing a host of legacy challenges caused by the incomplete scientific knowledge of the past. This last quote from Shawn Otto hits on an important role, the role of legacy challenges on the ideas or beliefs based on old truths that can be very detrimental to advancements needed to properly safeguard the population and the world around us. This year, I used the movie Concussion to try to make this point with my students in hopes of illustrating the problem, because the movie does an excellent job of putting all of the pieces of the puzzle together and showing how science is really important in making a decision, but it cannot be the only thing you use when you make a decision. So when we got started, this was the goal. The science being addressed in the movie is impact force as it relates to momentum and impulse. The basic synopsis is that Dr. Amalu identifies a correlation between football collisions and CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The goal for the science for the students is that they see a real-life situation where momentum actually takes place. In this case, specifically the brain, which is free to move in the skull, experiences a really large impact force over a short period of time. The impact actually can lead to damage in the brain tissue of a player, which has played roles, or it appears to have played roles in some tragic deaths of NFL players. As a teacher, it's my goal to try to figure out how to make it so the kids will buy into this. So the idea was to try to make it personal for them, to make them see that no decision was black and white, and that you have to consider multiple things, including the science, to make a proper decision. So the first question I asked the students was, are legacy challenges playing a role in decisions made by the NFL? And their answers were yes and no. They felt that at the time frame that the movie was being filmed in, that yes, it was. The rationale was that at that time that they were presenting in the movie, the NFL didn't really think there was enough proof between the correlation of activity on the football field and the effects to the mental health of the players. The NFL was actually using legacy beliefs to keep them away from really believing what was going on. No was the answer in terms of now, because they thought that there were advancements made in football. They said the increased padding in both the helmets and the body pads is helping to reduce the impact force. And in addition, there have been changes made to the game to reduce the number of concussions. So that led us to the second question. The second question was, even with the changes made to the game, there is still no guarantee that some football players may not incur the same damage. Knowing this, if you were a member of the governing body of the NFL, would you continue football? The students had no problem sharing their decisions based on their opinions of the game itself. The attitudes and information changed as we presented information. And it became very obvious in class the students had very little experience of debating an issue and not getting angry about it. So it was a very good thing. So we'll start with my pro football people. My pro football people said yes, the football should continue. In fact, the very act of taking it away was like a personal attack on them. My most outspoken student immediately reminded me that he lived in a democracy where he had the right to do whatever he wanted to do and no one was going to take his rights away from him. In a little bit calmer mannerism, another student said that as long as the player realizes the potential risk, they should have the right to play. And again, the students brought up that there have been changes made to football, so they feel that it should continue. Within the counter-argument part, we did bring up a discussion of what democracy really was, and that democracy does not mean you get to do whatever you want to do. That democracy really means that we have to make decisions in the greater good of all people. My one student still was not happy with that definition. Secondly, we pointed out that often youth sports that are selected for a child are typically based, not all the time, but typically based on the love or passions of their parents. So a child will end up loving and becoming devoted to a sport before they're even old enough to make a decision. So by the time they're an adult and they have to make the decision, it's really hard to make an unbiased decision, even though you know there's potential risk involved. So that was a problem. And the final thing they came out with on the yes side is that even though there have been improvements, hits are still occurring, so there's still the potential that damage could occur. So then we get to the other side, which was just as biased as the previous side. So my non-athletically focused students, of course, they were very passionate people, and they said, no, you must put the value of the person in front of the game. Ironically, the first person to defend this position made it well known that his opinion, because he happened to be one of my most gifted artists, was based on his view of his world. He made it apparent that his lack of passion for the sport and his inability to see any connection at all between the NFL and his future as a graphic designer was behind the scene. So when we had our counter discussion on this one, and we emphasized the economy, how much the NFL puts into our economy, his view really became upset, especially when it was highlighted that they hire a boatload of graphic designers, advertisers, concession crews, ground crews, along with many others, and that it really would have a very dramatic impact on us as a whole. The students finally realized at the end that the decision made by the governing body couldn't be limited to the science nor just the business, that they had to consider both parts to make a good decision. They decided that an increase in the safety features of the equipment must continue with a focus on identifying concussions quickly and accurately to minimize future risks. In addition, rules and fines need to continue as a deterrent, and that most importantly, they have to be enforced. If they're not enforced, they're of no value. Complete removal of the sport would actually turn out to be worse for more people, and so they decided that the only option was to try to reduce the number of injuries but continue the sport. Lucky for the NFL. So that was the decision. So through the discussion, it really became, the kids started picking up the idea of using facts, but it's really hard to make decisions without having feelings because that's so much more of our life. The hope was that they would identify the protocol that they'd have to follow so that we could go on to be a population that makes more decisions based on facts rather than on legacy ideas. We discussed that an educated populace would allow for the development of more governing similar to the approach that is currently that is being attempted to be used by New Zealand, which uses peer-reviewed data to make their government decisions. And their plan goes something like this. It's a three-step plan. The science advisor is a nonpartisan person appointed to the position. If an issue comes up, the science advisor is supposed to compile a substantive report that talks about just the peer-reviewed data involved with the issue. That report goes back to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister convenes a committee of senior policy advisors. The senior policy advisors sit down, and based on the data that they're given, they come up with possible policy changes. Then the final step is that once they make their suggestions for policies, that goes back to the science advisor, who convenes a committee, and they look at the potential policy changes and look at it from a scientific perspective to see which ones will have the greatest effect. Otto's book outlines this whole thing, and the biggest goal in it is that he wants you to see the importance that we can't have a government that doesn't work together with other groups, so that the science and the government communities need to work together. Because as one understands the important data that you need to use for the decision, the other group understands how it's going to affect the overall governing of it. Working together with non-biased information, solutions can be developed that benefit the greater good. And to me, this gets back to the heart of what was originally said by Thomas Jefferson. I really think this was more their idea of what they were thinking for with democracy. Seeing the connection between science, business, and math, and how important all are to making a sound decision may be really obvious to people. The idea that decisions need to be free of emotion is not easy for people. It's really important that I make you understand that by no means am I saying that if we look at things with an objective mind, that I am trying to remove emotions. By studying science, that I want students to remove emotions from their world. It's just the opposite. I want them to use their understanding of science to make the world a more vivid and miraculous adventure. So the second connection I want to share with you has more to do with emotions, and it has to do with the relationship between art and the knowledge of science. I want them to see that the knowledge of science as it relates to greater appreciation of arts, in this case I'm going to talk specifically about music. In the textbook, Conceptual Physics, they talk about a relationship between science and art as this. They say science is mostly concerned with discovering and recording natural phenomena. The arts are concerned with the values of human interactions as they pertain to the senses. It is my perspective that when you put the two parts together, you begin to live in a really 3D world where you get the full meaning of what's going on. Now, the question is, how do I make the kids feel the same thing that I think I'm experiencing? Being blessed, being raised by a father that was very musically gifted, I had the pleasure of going to a lot of concerts, especially because I had a lot of older siblings, and I'd have to go to a lot of band concerts. And early on, I learned very early with my father's help how to identify both instruments by sight and sound, and he would have discussions with me about the challenges of playing different instruments. I myself participated in band throughout middle school and high school playing the clarinet, and during that time you learn very quickly how you have to feel the music or else the band conductor is not thrilled with you. My favorite pieces, we used to play every Christmas in our band. We'd play a piece called Russian Christmas Music. And if there was ever a piece that I really could feel this with, was this piece. It's one of the few pieces you play in high school that has a huge chime part, a huge gong part, and it just was a magnificent thing to be sitting inside that piece when it was being played. It was during my senior year that I began to realize the relationship between the band using the tuner prior to class and the concept of interference in physics. The whole idea that if the clarinet's tuned to the same note, you avoid having that twang that is often heard when you go to that lovely fourth grade concert where no one's in tune. As a teacher, I needed a way for my students to see how interference generates the feeling or tone of a situation. The solution came one summer when I rented the movie August Rush for a family movie night at our house. The movie perfectly illustrates the value of music to a movie and highlights the positive use of both constructive and destructive interference in setting a tone. Prior to watching the movie, a discussion takes place regarding terms that we used in music class, which were consonants and dissonance. Consonants meaning harmony, dissonance meaning harsh sounds. We established how they're related to interference. Just this discussion alone did an excellent job of helping my students that love music make a correlation between that and studying physics. In addition, it helped those that just don't always see why we're studying something, and they began answering the proverbial question, when will I ever use this? The students are asked to select scenes that feature a music backdrop represented by both types of sound. The movie is an excellent resource for the students to make the interference feeling connection, because the whole story is about a musical piece being written about a boy's life. The class isolates the dark scenes containing extremely harsh tones and rhythms, and the comforting scenes tend to have melodic blended tones. Most importantly, the students see how specific instruments are assigned to characters in the movie, which become pieces in the actual rhapsody at the end of the movie. One character is symbolized by a guitar with modern edgy music. I guess you can guess who he is. And then the other character is symbolized with a cello, and she plays very melodic, melancholy music most of the movie. The final resolution is heard at the end of the piece, in the end of this rhapsody, when harmonic tones are highlighted by French horns producing a warm, loving feeling. The rhapsody itself is just an amazing thing. The kids were very shocked at how, when we went through and listened to the rhapsody a couple of times, how they could remember each scene that went on with that particular piece of the music. So during the discussion, we went over, we talked about what feelings we had during different scenes, but the most rewarding experience I've ever had in the post-discussion came from one of my young ladies who was very athletic, but I don't think she was very musically interested. And she sat there in the back of the room, and she was just in a very awestruck state, saying that she never, ever considered listening to music in that way, which gets to the heart of what we are looking for as teachers, is to try and open up an experience that is new to the students. So let's go back to the beginning question. Why do I want my students to study as much science as possible? I want all my students to experience the world through a clear lens, one that uses science knowledge to amplify the beauty that surrounds them and to understand the effects choices can have on their lives. I want my students to read the January Buffalo News article about Nitmo, a former NFL player currently struggling with CTE, and make judgments regarding his life based on their knowledge of impact forces and the role these forces are playing in his day-to-day struggles. I want my students to understand how the democratic principles they study apply to science. I want them to realize that using peer-related data will increase the likelihood of sound conclusions and policies being developed. But most importantly, I want my students to avoid living in a country where believing takes the place of knowing.